Oh, good morning, and thank you very much to you for Climate and UNDP for having me at such an interesting and vital event. Today, I wanted to go through the top line messaging from our 2021 World Energy Outlook, which just came out, which the IEA wanted to essentially coincide with COP26. So in the run-up to COP26, we saw the economic recovery after the pandemic has put global energy markets under a lot of strain. We've seen a lot of sharp rises in prices. We've also seen a lot of weather-related factors, which are having significant implications for the energy sector. We're also seeing that a new global energy economy is emerging, with renewables and electric vehicles all setting new records. However, as we know very well, the shadow of the pandemic still looms large. Omicron is certainly may have an effect on things, and this has really set back progress on energy access. So we know that climate ambitions have never been higher. However, here at the IEA, we're seeing that energy and emissions data does not match the rhetoric. So this special edition of the World Energy Outlook explores the transformation of the energy sector in great detail. And it examines where the world is heading and how this will actually change if countries meet all of their announced pledges. We look at how the world can keep the door open to 1.5 degrees Celsius following our landmark net zero by 2050 report. And we also discuss the opportunities and benefits that lie along the way, as well as the implications for the energy security. So over the last 20 years, global carbon dioxide emissions have risen substantially, although the 2010s did show signs of an uncertain plateau. And looking back at our baseline before the Paris Climate Summit, we actually saw a continued emissions growth out to 2050. This would have led to a catastrophic level of warming of about 3.5 degrees in 2100. But now we're seeing a very different picture. And this is especially emerging in the energy sector, thanks to new policies, technology cost reductions, as well as the economic impact of the pandemic. We have a stated policy scenario, which I'll refer to in the future as STEPS. This includes all of the latest legislated policies and regulatory targets, but it doesn't have announced net zero pledges, nor does it have updated NDCs. So in STEPS, we see a near-term peak in global emissions in 2026, and after that, a very slow decline. So this gets us to reduce by almost a degree our projections of 2100 warming. So this gets us to 2.6 degrees, but this is well above the temperatures that we need, that were the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in the last year or so, countries accounting for up to 70% of global emissions have announced net zero targets. And around 120 countries have submitted new or updated 2030 NDCs. And these account for slightly more than half of global emissions. So we have incorporated these new policy ambitions and net zero pledges into the announced pledges scenario, which we'll analyze in detail for the first time in this year's WEO. And if these are implemented in full, this would lead to a substantial change in the emissions pathway compared to STEPS. Emissions would peak in the mid-2020s and then enter into a steady decline. And by 2050, they would be about 40% below current levels. This gets us within a striking distance of, below 2 degrees Celsius. And so by the time that we published this in mid-October, more than 120 countries announced new targets for emissions reduction by 2030. And we had governments around the world representing about 70% of CO2 emissions pledging to bring those emissions to net zero by 2050. And then since mid-October, countries have been raising their ambitions even further. We saw pledges from India to hit net zero by 2070. We saw a lot of other interesting things that aren't just limited to CO2 emissions. We saw more than 100 countries promising to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And so all of this updated analysis for all of these new announcements means that if they are met in full and on time, this would be enough to hold the rise in global temperatures to 1.8 degrees C by the end of the century. And this is truly a landmark moment. So under our STEP scenario, energy demand continues to grow. Within the next decade, looking very much like the past decade, where we're seeing the share of fossil fuels in the global energy mix declining only slightly from 79% today to about 75% in 2030. So our announced pledges scenario actually reshapes the global energy market. And by 2030, the share of unabated fossil fuels declines to 72% of the global energy mix. So we're seeing that oil is going to peak by 2025 and flatten. And a lot of that is driven by a reverse of trends of oil use for cars, a lot of new EV sales. We're stopping new sales of internal combustion engines. For natural gas demand, we're seeing a maximum level soon after 2025, and then a flattening driven by the power sector, where we're seeing gas demand really falling 42 BCM lower than 2020, especially for countries with net zero targets. Natural gas really loses market share with the growing role of solar and wind. The building sector is also seeing a decrease in gas demand with the introduction of new, very strict performance standards. So the announced pledges also really further accelerate the uptake of solar PV and wind. So we're seeing that the growth of solar PV and wind keeps up with all growth in electricity demand over the next decade. So moving over to coal, which is the source of about 40% of all energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in 2020. Despite a record 4% drop in 2020 due to the pandemic, we've seen that coal use in 2021 is rebounding strongly. And coal-fired power plants alone made up about 30% of global energy-related emissions in 2020. So this is a top priority for clean energy transitions. Now, the first task in phasing out coal emissions is stopping the construction of new coal-fired power plants. And this could really reduce electricity emissions for decades. However, the construction of new coal-fired power plants has actually been on the rise. And we saw more new coal added in the last decade than ever before. So at the start of 2021, there were over 9,000 coal plants in operation located across the world in nearly 100 countries. If we leave these unchecked, these plants will emit about 250 gigatons of CO2 emissions over the next 30 years. So that's about half the remaining emissions budget for 1.5 degrees C. So looking forward, there are 140 gigawatts of new coal plants under construction worldwide and 3 times that much planned. And so while we have announced pledges canceling about 20% of planned plants, 350 gigawatts would still be built. But we do have opportunities to move the needle. We've seen that China pledging to stop building new coal plants abroad. That would cancel about 190 gigawatts and reduce CO2 emissions by about 20 gigatons to 2050. And if we really fully realize this opportunity, then this decade could be the last with new unabated coal-fired power plants. And there are also ways to cut emissions from coal plants that are being built, while also limiting the associated job impacts, contributing to transitions and maintaining electricity security. You could retrofit plants with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or co-fired with low emissions fuels such as biomass or ammonia. You can also repurpose plants to focus on system adequacy or flexibility. You can retire coal plants early, which means that you could potentially convert it to renewable energy projects or energy storage facilities. So despite the progress that we've seen in the announced pledges scenario, there's still a substantial gap to the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. This gap is particularly large in the short term to 2030, as we see near-term action lagging behind the pace seen in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. So we have total CO2e emissions are 36 gigatons in the announced pledges scenario, and we've gotten that down by 3 gigatons compared to the STEPS, the stated policy scenario. But this means that announced pledges close only 20% of the gap between STEPS and net zero. And so we're still trying to fill the gap of 14 gigatons. Countries with pledges, as well as countries without, are each responsible for about half the remaining gap between announced pledges and net zero. This indicates that all countries need to step up their ambitions if we're going to close this gap. In the longer term, as action accelerates in the announced pledges scenario, it closes about 40% of the gap in 2050 between stated policies and net zero. But there is a real risk that this delayed near-term action will put net zero out of reach. It risks leaving us too much to do in the 2030s with too much locked-in emissions and too little progress on innovation in clean energy technologies. And if we're going to meet 1.5 degrees, we need to reach net zero by 2050. But we do have some cost-effective ways to close this gap. It's an ambition gap of 14 gigatons in 2030, and we need to close it. But we do have policies and technologies available to close this gap. And a substantial share of the necessary emission reductions comes from cost-effective and well-understood technology measures. So we have country by country and sector by sector analysis, and this shows that over 40% of the 2030 ambition gap between announced policies and net zero could be closed with cost-effective technology measures, provided that policymakers put in place the right enabling conditions. So we estimate that 60% of the additional generation of wind and solar required to close the gap in the electricity sector could be achieved cost-effectively. And this would avoid about 2.3 gigatons of CO2 emissions. So that's about 15% of the gap. So more than half of a gigaton of additional reductions could be achieved through other cost-effective measures in the power sector. So we're talking about hydropower expansion in emerging markets and developing economies. We're also talking about nuclear power. This is a cost-effective measure in certain cases, nuclear lifetime extensions in advanced economies, obviously with independent safety checks. We also are looking at new nuclear and select markets where projects can be delivered on budget by established industries. Reducing fossil fuel methane leaks is another critical measure. We have about 1.7 gigatons of CO2e that could be reduced cost effectively through measures that are technically relatively well understood. This includes technology standards to reduce emissions during operations, more frequent and robust leak detection, and other policies to reduce non-emergency venting and flaring to zero. Of course, we can't forget about energy efficiency. This provides huge opportunities to reduce emissions cost effectively. So we think end-use energy efficiency could provide another gigaton of cost-effective reductions. This is about fuel economy standards, especially for trucking, appliance performance standards, and industrial energy efficiency. So what about the other 60% of reductions? About 25% of this is from measures that reduce demand in addition to the energy efficiency measures already discussed. So very important is to think about the role of materials efficiency in the industry sector. This is going to be a little bit more complicated because this requires both organizational and technology changes on the part of both producers and consumers. But a lot of this has the potential to be very cost effective. Now, another 15% can be seen as investments bringing down the cost of technologies such as hydrogen, advanced batteries, carbon capture, utilization storage, and advanced biofuels. Now, we at the IEA understand and know that the bulk of these measures will not be cost effective by 2030. But if we invest and we enhance near-term deployment, we can spur innovation and accelerate the framework to deploy these enabling infrastructures to basically allow these technologies to play out in a more cost-effective way in the 2030s. So looking to energy markets and investment, for many years, the WEO and the IEA have warned of a potential mismatch between investment in oil and gas supply and an investment in clean energy technologies. Now, in the case of oil and gas, upstream investment is about half of what it was in 2014, while oil and gas demand, even with the effects of the pandemic, has not changed anything similar. The industry has become so much more efficient. It can do so much more with less. Upstream operations are much leaner, but still this new normal that we're observing for oil and gas investment appears geared towards a future in which consumption of oil and gas is stagnant or even in decline. So in practice, spending on oil and gas production since 2020 is broadly aligned with the near-term amounts that are projected in the net zero pathway, in which there are no new fields approved after 2021, and there are sharp reductions in fossil fuel demand. So investment in clean energy technologies and related infrastructure was a lot more resilient in 2020, and we're expecting there to be a slight uptick in 2021. But while oil and gas investment was broadly aligned with net zero, the same cannot be said for today's investment in energy transitions. This needs to more than triple. So if you don't have the boost that we're just seeing in the right-hand side of this figure, you can't have the left-hand figure, oil and gas figure, while still maintaining reliable energy supply. And so a lot of the shock and volatility that we're seeing in energy markets today is not related to clean energy transitions, nor is it related to climate policies. But the mismatch that you're looking at on the screen does create risk for the future. The way out of this impasse is clear. We need a major boost in clean energy investment across all technologies and all markets. But while this imbalance remains unresolved, there will remain a strong risk of further sharp price swings and increased volatility in the future. So the transformation of the energy sector is, of course, motivated by the fight against climate change. But that doesn't mean that all of the benefits are environmental. There are also huge commercial, industrial, and employment gains for those that make the leap to the new global energy economy. If the world gets on track for net zero emissions by 2050, then the cumulative market opportunity for the manufacture of wind turbines, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, electrolyzers, fuel cells, this amounts to about 27 trillion US dollars. So in a net zero pathway, these 5 equipment markets alone would be of comparable size to today's oil market by mid-century. This creates enormous prospects for companies that are well-positioned along a growing set of global supply chains. We see opportunities in a range of other areas as well. Even in a much more electrified system, there are huge openings for fuel suppliers. Companies producing and delivering low carbon gases in 2050 are handling the equivalent of almost half of today's global natural gas market. So the clean energy jobs created in the coming decades are far, far larger than those lost in sectors that go into decline. At the IEA, we're estimating that almost 30 million new clean energy jobs are created in the net zero scenario to 2030. This is far higher than jobs that are lost in declining sectors. That is not to discount the importance of support for workers and communities in those sectors. This is absolutely essential. And at the IEA, we are working with the Global Commission for Inclusive People-Centered Transitions. But we also want to keep in mind that the broad benefits of energy transitions for lives and livelihoods today and in the future. So in conclusion, the transition to a sustainable energy system is the solution to the turbulence we're seeing in global energy markets. This is not the cause. We need a laser-like focus on clean electrification. We also need to focus on energy efficiency, methane abatement, and this can close the near-term gap with a 1.5 degrees C future. And we know that cost-effective solutions are available today, and every country needs to step up. And the longer today's mismatch in energy investment persists, the greater the risks to energy security and volatility. The only way forward is a massive policy-driven surge in clean energy transitions. We're also seeing a new global energy economy emerging. This will be more electrified, more efficient, more digitalized, and cleaner. And this offers enormous potential for growth and employment. Governments have unrivaled capacity to transform the energy sector, but a wave of investment in a net zero future is necessary, and this must stem directly from COP26. Thank you very much.